I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Keith Whittington, who is going to speak to us today about why we should value campus free speech. The William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University, Professor Whittington is the author or editor of more than a dozen learned and influential books, 80 major essays, I counted them from your CV, and recently a powerful book on campus free speech, Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. One blurb for the book observed that if John Stuart Mill were strolling campuses today, this is the book he would have written about the need for free speech in higher education now. Its incisive, pragmatic, philosophical approach is indeed transformational and Millian, and probably the reason that Speak Freely was required reading in the summer of 2018 for all incoming Princeton students, and why it won this year's Association of American Publishers Prose Award for the best book in education. At Princeton, Professor Whittington writes and teaches about American constitutional law, politics and history, and American political thought. This past fall, he taught a course on free speech and the law, and we are lucky to have him here today in the middle of a semester when he is teaching a course on constitutional difficulties in the age of Trump. Please welcome Keith Whittington.
So thank you. I have to admit this speech is a bit of a digression from what I normally work on. A lot of what I do focuses on structural features of the Constitution. Lots of those issues I thought were purely of academic interest, so a big chunk of my dissertation was on presidential impeachments, for example, which I thought would not be relevant at all to anything. And then not long after I finished that project and it was about to come out as a book, Bill Clinton was impeached, and I thought, well, that's a once in a couple of lifetimes kind of event. Won't happen again, and yet here we are talking about impeachments yet again. But despite those interests, it seemed worth talking about and trying to work through questions of campus free speech as well. I've been, and as I started working on the book, I realized I've been thinking about this issue for quite some time. It's been sort of percolating in the back of my mind, in part because there has been a long series of events that are troubling about how people are thinking about speech on campus, but also how people are thinking about what the purpose of universities are more generally. And so part of why I wound up coming to this topic is not only out of an interest in free speech, and as we'll see, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about with your questions, that category of free speech is a big and broad category, includes a lot of stuff in contemporary debates associated with university campuses and the ideas of free speech. Not all those things actually sit together very neatly or very well. But I also think that free speech is a way of trying to think about why we even value universities and higher education more generally, what the point of a university is. And so I tried to structure the book not in terms of what does the constitutional law require that we do, what are judges going to force a set of public universities to do relative to First Amendment principles, for example, but what should we as members of a campus community care about, and what should we value on a campus community, and what kinds of rules and principles and practices should we be embracing ourselves and for how we want to govern ourselves and try to organize our space on campus. I think these are persistent and enduring concerns on college campuses that are going to continue to be relevant long after the sort of immediate incidents of free speech problems that are tracked outside of attention might come to. I think we will continue to be struggling with on college campuses themselves these issues of why are we here, what is it we're trying to do, how should we organize ourselves in order to do those things effectively. Certainly if you talk to people outside of college campuses, one of their instincts in thinking about these free speech issues on college campuses is to think that the problem is the current snowflake generation of students. And I think this is the wrong way of thinking about the issue generally. It's the wrong way of thinking about students on campuses today more broadly. I don't think students today are uniquely intolerant or create particular problems from a free speech perspective relative to students that came before them, or indeed relative to other Americans more generally. And so partially, I don't think empirically it's the right explanation in thinking about what's going on college campuses, but I think it also focuses our attention on the wrong kind of problem. If we start talking about whether there's something wrong with the kids today, and that's what's really driving these campus controversies at the moment. Instead, I think we should recognize that what we're seeing on college campuses is really a reflection of a very fundamental issue and long-term problem about how liberal democracies work more generally. That is to say, tolerance is very difficult. And it's difficult not only for students on college campuses today, but it's difficult for their predecessors on college campuses, and it's difficult for Americans more generally. Social scientists for decades now have been doing surveys of a range of different kinds of populations, asking them questions about how much they tolerate those that they disagree with, how important are values like free speech to them. One reason why empirical social scientists have been interested in these concerns is a concern that arose out of World War II and the problems of democracies tilting over into authoritarian systems, which led people to wonder, well, how do average people actually think about these issues, and how deeply rooted are a set of democratic values in American life more generally, as well as the life of other countries. And one thing that's striking about these kinds of surveys, like I said, they've been done for decades now, and asking to all kinds of populations ranging from current college students to American voters broadly to various kinds of elites like journalists and lawyers and politicians to faculty members over time. So there's a wide range of surveys asking a lot of different populations, slightly different kinds of questions over time, but a very striking persistence of a basic finding in doing this kind of research. And that is that if you ask people in the abstract, do you value free speech? Is toleration important? Should you tolerate people that you disagree with? Should you tolerate other kinds of groups? People overwhelmingly tend to say yes in the United States. These are core values. People recognize they're important values in the nature of American democracy, and in the abstract, they're perfectly willing to endorse them. And that's as true of the current generation of college students as has been true of other Americans over time. But it's also true of the current generation of college students, just like it's been true of other Americans over time. If you start asking them more specific questions, not about these abstract categories of what do you think about free speech, what do you think about tolerance, more generally, how important are these values, but you start asking them more particularly, well, what about this example of free speech? What about this particular group that is driving controversies? Do you think we should tolerate these people? Do you think we should tolerate this kind of speech? Should we allow this kind of speech or start restricting it? And a much more significant percentage of Americans start backpedaling at that point. They start trying to carve out exceptions, they start trying to qualify their commitments to free speech and toleration, and start emphasizing the idea, well, I didn't mean that. That, of course, is an abuse of free speech. It's not genuine free speech, and so, of course, we ought to exclude that. That varies a lot as to what exactly those examples are of things that people find offensive. So the things that students today in colleges are likely to find deeply offensive and troubling are very different than things their parents or grandparents would have found deeply or troubling. But all Americans have something that they find troubling in terms of particular instances of speech, and as a consequence, there are all kinds of things that Americans wind up starting to back away from. And so I think our general challenge in a democracy is to recognize that people have very fundamental disagreements about how to live our lives, how we ought to organize society more generally, what our politics look like, what our religions ought to look like. And we try to hash those kinds of disagreements out in public. We try to have collective conversations about these important issues. We try to come to some collective decisions about these important issues, and that requires hearing each other out and being able to participate in a common conversation. But it's deeply difficult to engage in those kind of conversations, because the people that you're engaged in conversations with on these topics are people that you disagree with in very fundamental kinds of ways. I think, though, universities are particularly important places where we ought to be trying to uphold this ideal of being able to talk to people we disagree with and be able to explore ideas that we find disturbing and unpleasant. We ought to be trying to uphold these ideals in American society more generally. It's important in public life broadly that we be tolerant of dissent, we be tolerant of those we disagree with, but it's particularly important for those of us on college campuses to want to do that. For our American society more generally, we want to do it in part because of the importance of liberal democracy and how we make democracy work better. For university campuses, though, it's tied in particular to a particular understanding of what our mission is and why we're here, which, as I understand, is ultimately an effort to try to understand and find the truth. That we're trying to produce and disseminate knowledge. And if that's what we're primarily trying to do, we're trying to work on the frontiers of human knowledge, push those frontiers further outward, and communicate what it is we've learned, then in that context, we need free speech as a component of that. We need to be able to ask hard questions. We need to be able to pursue the evidence and arguments wherever they might lead, and sometimes come to very difficult answers that are controversial answers, answers that others might find very disturbing. But part of what we're trying to do on university campuses is be places where we can ask those hard questions and sometimes come to those difficult answers. We want to be able to scrutinize things as best we can in order to pursue the truth as best we can. And as a consequence, we need to be places that are open to experimentation, unconventional thinking, and ultimately to mistakes. The part of what you're trying to protect with a free speech environment is for people to be able to make intellectual mistakes, for people to be able to say bad ideas, because we don't know how bad the ideas are until we've explored them, until we've thought about them carefully, until we begin to see what the difficulties with them are. And moreover, we can't fully appreciate why, in fact, we hold the ideas we do and why they're particularly valuable and why we think they're good, unless we can think about the contrast between the ideas that we hold most dear and those bad ideas that we ultimately want to reject. We want to be able to see why it is that we're committed to our own commitments, and part of the process by which we can do that more effectively is by understanding what the flaws are in other people's arguments, as well as being open to the possibility that some of our own ideas have to be modified and perhaps even rejected in some circumstances. This is not the way that American universities have always worked. American universities have not always been committed to the idea that they should be operating on the frontiers of human knowledge and trying to push these things outward. This is really a conception of universities that emerged in the late 19th century, and lots of new universities were being established in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. A lot of older universities were being reformed in pretty dramatic ways in order to come up to speed with this new conception of what it is we ought to be doing in universities more broadly. And as we reconceptualize the mission and what it is we're trying to accomplish in higher education, it brought with it a new appreciation of the importance of free inquiry on college campuses in ways that simply were not very appreciated much earlier in American history. So this new view about what higher education is supposed to be like and what colleges and universities ought to be like was expressed by lots of people, but among them, one of these reformers was Daniel Coit Gilman, who was the first president of Johns Hopkins University. And when he was taking over the presidency of this newly established university, he gave a speech to the board of trustees of the university. And this came at the tail end of Reconstruction in the latter part of the 19th century. And Gilman wanted to characterize Hopkins in a particular way, in keeping with this new vision of what universities are supposed to be, but definitely a break from the past. So he told the board of trustees, "The institution we are about to organize would not be worthy of the name of a university if it were to be devoted to any other purpose than the discovery and promulgation of the truth. And it would be ignoble in the extreme that the resources which have been given by the founder without restrictions should be limited to the maintenance of ecclesiastical differences or perverted to the promotion of political strife. As the spirit of the university should be that of one of intellectual freedom and the pursuit of truth and of the broadest charity toward those with whom we differ in opinion, it is certain that sectarian and partisan preferences should have no control of the selection of teachers and should not be apparent in the official work of the university." This is a vision of the university in which you're willing to bring together a wide range of people with disagreements and different ideas. We're going to bring them together and allow them to exchange those ideas and work out those disagreements among themselves. The university should not be dedicated to trying to identify orthodoxies and preserve those orthodoxies in order to resist all those who would criticize it. Instead, universities should be places where we bring the dissenters indoors. We bring the dissenters into the institution itself in order to have them ask us the hard questions that will force us together to try to make progress toward understanding the truth. So in the course of the book, I try to lay out the argument as to why it is that this is the fundamental mission of the university, why free speech is intimately connected to it. I won't try to rehearse all the details of that argument. Here, I just want to note a couple of key points before then moving on to thinking about some of the kinds of applications we might see in particular issues of campus free speech. But the basic concern is to say, in part, We can only gain true knowledge, ultimately, if we're able to test it with argument. That is the only reason why we can be confident in what we think we know, is if we hear what the criticisms of those arguments are, we hear what the evidence is, we hear what the concerns are, we hear what the critics have to say about the arguments, and we're willing to explore those ideas and push them to the limit. And once we've seen our arguments and our ideas survive those kinds of challenges, we've held them up against critical scrutiny, we've heard the best arguments that can be offered on the other side, then we can have more comfort that in the quality of the ideas that we continue to hold. But we also might learn things in that process, including things about how we can make our own ideas better, our own arguments better. We may learn things about the ways in which we need to revise our arguments. And we may even learn things about some arguments and ideas that we thought we should believe in that in fact we need to set aside because they're mistaken or problematic in various kinds of ways. But we only know that through having that open inquiry, through that openness and willingness to engage with people who might disagree with us. But secondly, I think it's also true that, particularly in the case of controversial speech, that we've learned over the course of American history that we can't trust any potential censor empowered to suppress disfavored speech. And American constitutional law has been particularly concerned with this kind of problem. That is, especially in the context in which we're talking about ideas that we have fundamental disagreements with, it's not possible to entrust anyone with the ability to say, you get to choose which ideas ought to be suppressed because they're too dangerous, they're too problematic, they're too troubling, they're too threatening to American society and American moral order. Because in hindsight, we tend to think those people who have been exercising that kind of power will abuse it in various ways. They will suppress the ideas, they will suppress the arguments that are threatening to their own power. They will suppress the arguments that are threatening to their own particular concerns, and not necessarily those ideas that are beneficial for the public interest more generally. So we ought to be extraordinarily cautious before empowering people to make those decisions for us. Instead, American constitutional law has driven us towards saying we ought to be open to hearing those arguments, hearing those ideas, and in doing that, we're going to hear lots of bad ideas. We're going to, in fact, hear lots of dangerous ideas. But the only place that we can actually trust those ideas to be heard and discussed and thought through and ultimately accepted or rejected is with the American citizenry themselves, rather than some particular official who is charged with the ability to making those decisions for us and protecting us from the ideas that they think we might be seduced by or that they think might be too disturbing to hear. So I think with those kinds of principles in mind, we're in a better position than think through the kind of particular controversies that have arisen over time. At the very heart of a university's operations, we should respect the freedom to pursue scholarship and teaching with regard only to professional standards and the pursuit of truth, and without regard to social and political pressures. Universities have long been dedicated to that view that they ought to be protecting academic freedom quite broadly. They ought to protect the freedom of professors to engage in teaching and research and follow the logic of their inquiries wherever they go. The concept of academic freedom is designed to protect exactly those kinds of concerns, not to protect faculty to be able to say anything at all, but to protect the freedom to be able to push the boundaries of human knowledge outward, and the freedom of inquiry ultimately. And this is extraordinarily important. I think it comes under threat even today, although happily academic freedom tends to be respected on college campuses, and college campuses have tried to generate a range of policies and institutions designed to protect the academic freedom of faculty to do research and teaching. But nonetheless, we see various pressures, some of those pressures from inside college campuses, some of those pressures from outside college campuses to try to silence, suppress, fire, terminate, remove faculty who say things that we find too controversial, whether the we that's finding them controversial means some of the students on college campuses, or the we that find it too controversial are influential alumni or donors off college campus, or even politicians more broadly. And colleges ought to be dedicated to precisely protect faculty from those kinds of external pressures in order to insist that ultimately faculty ought to be pursuing ideas wherever they might lead, even if they lead them to quite controversial kinds of conclusions. But college campuses are vibrant intellectual communities well beyond what professors are doing in their own scholarship and teaching. And so I'm happy to come back and talk more about the academic freedom and the interest of the scholarly enterprise itself, but a lot of the free speech debates surrounding college campuses are really not about that core enterprise of scholarship and teaching that occurs in college campuses. It's instead about the debate in the public sphere around college campuses. What kind of conversations are we having in general, not just in the classroom, but on the public square of universities and college campuses. And I think a great deal would be lost ultimately if we're willing to sacrifice our freedom to engage in ideas in those spaces, those common spaces, among a wide range of members of the campus community, and restricted our freedoms only to the core of academic freedom, only to the core of what happens in the classroom and what happens in research. It was a struggle to get universities to recognize that an important part of their role in American society more generally is to be a place where you can have these kind of robust public debates about matters of general concerns. Universities at various points have been very tempted to try to restrict exactly those kind of conversations that occur on campus, in part because they are occurring in public, in part because they're visible, in part because they're often threatening to people who have intellectual, moral, religious, or political or economic interest that are odds with what it is that people on campus are trying to talk about and debate. And university leaders have often been willing to move in response to these kind of outside pressures in order to try to suppress debates that are occurring on college campuses that are seen as too discomforting to various people. And that takes a variety of forms. So for example, it's taken the form of trying to suppress student groups on college campuses. So one way in which we encourage a robust intellectual environment in which we can explore a wide range of ideas is to make it relatively easy for students to form their own autonomous student groups in order to explore ideas that they find particularly interesting and explore them in the ways that they find interesting and engaging. And universities are often very tempted to try to limit those student groups, limit what they can do, but also eliminate student groups entirely that they find to be raising the wrong kinds of ideas. And it's been a long struggle to convince universities that in fact they ought to open themselves up to a wide range of student groups exploring a wide range of ideas. Some of those universities that tried to restrict student groups in this way have been public universities, and public universities have particular problems in this regard because they're bound by First Amendment principles, and as a consequence they've generated some lawsuits around these issues in ways that's much less true of private universities. But I think these public universities have found themselves in these legal crosshairs are nonetheless reflective of the kinds of concerns we ought to have more generally. So for example, when Virginia Commonwealth University tried to ban the Gay Alliance for Students in the 1970s for promoting what its university officials characterized as aberrant, even sickening ideas that indeed were illegal at the time in Virginia, a federal circuit court had to point out to the university that student associations devoted to the advocacy of political, social, legal, and other objectives are part of higher education, ultimately useful for the preparation of students for later life. The universities are precisely places where you can explore unconventional ideas, including ideas that the mainstream of American society at the time might regard as deeply offensive, and moreover, that American society might in fact want to declare illegal. But nonetheless, universities ought to be places where students can explore those ideas, have those conversations, and form associations of their own in order to explore those concerns. But universities are not only places where we've had sort of robust and quite civil debates, but also places that have been robust spaces for protests on college campuses. And universities ought to be places where it's possible for students and others to engage in protests in various ways. Students should be able to express themselves on matters of public concern in ways that make sense to them, in ways that can draw the attention of others to issues that they find particularly important and compelling, and to try to attract a debate and begin a debate that others might be reluctant to want to enter into. But it's inappropriate for protests to take the form of interfering with the ability of others to pursue their own activities on campus. Willing speakers should be able to communicate with willing audiences. Members of the campus community ultimately should be able to hear the ideas from those they want to hear from. And as a consequence then, disruptions, disinvitations, tearing down signs, throwing out newspapers are all efforts ultimately to quash communication and shut down the free communication of ideas rather than expand it. Students have a right to ignore speech that they find appalling or particularly unpersuasive, or to take up the challenge of countering such speech with arguments of their own. They need not engage with what they might call debates on settled topics, but they do not have the privilege of insisting that no one else is allowed to treat those as open questions, questions that can still be pursued, questions that can still be asked, questions that can still be explored. A college campus ultimately can't claim to be serious about trying to create an environment open to skeptical inquiry and free-ranging pursuit of the truth if it cannot tolerate the airing of controversial and discomforting ideas. Faculty and administrators do not have the courage of their convictions that they cannot tolerate having their students hear from speakers that university officials think are obnoxious or mistaken. But that also implies a responsibility on the part of those of us inviting speakers and hosting discussions on college campuses. The faculty hired by the university are evaluated by their peers for the quality of their scholarly work and their ability to meet disciplinary expectations about the understanding of their subject matter. Outside speakers who are brought to campus to discuss matters of public affair are not expected to meet those same standards. Their contributions to the intellectual community are different, but hopefully is still real contribution to what's happening on college campuses besides just what it is the faculty are doing on campuses. But the goal of bringing in such speakers should ultimately still be one of enlightenment and not simply provocation. The goal should be to hear from the best representatives of serious ideas that students and others think are worth their time and attention. And no doubt students will have somewhat different ideas than I do about what actually counts as an interesting and serious idea, what's actually worth their time and attention. But we ought to give students the freedom to be able to explore those ideas that make sense to them, that they're curious about and they find intriguing. But we should also emphasize to students that they have a responsibility in doing that to try to bring forward to campus people who can nonetheless communicate about serious ideas and engage seriously with things that are thoughtful and ultimately important. Embracing free speech is easy if speech never seems very challenging. It's easy to listen to pleasing ideas and affirmation of our own prior beliefs. It is much more difficult to learn to tolerate those with whom we disagree and who espouse ideas that we regard as preposterous, repugnant, or even dangerous. We should, however, learn not only to tolerate those disagreements, but to seek them out. For it is through controversy and contestation that we can make progress, and often in very unexpected ways. So let me end by noting that universities sometimes struggle to sustain the kind of diverse intellectual communities that would best facilitate the advancement and dissemination of knowledge. John Stuart Mill worried that a closed society, too comfortable in its own convictions, would retreat into dogmatism. Despite their own aspirations, universities risk retreating into their own comfortable intellectual bubbles. And universities must strive to screen out bad ideas, but they must also strive to bring to campus those who will question and not merely affirm received wisdom. If a community of scholars is not to become lethargic, and if the advancement of knowledge is to proceed, scholars cannot become complacent in their studies and blind to their own deficiencies and biases. Universities should be striving to nurture intellectual diversity on their own campuses. When training, hiring, and promoting scholars who make their home on college campuses, universities should demand rigor and professional accomplishment, but also openness to new ideas and a spirit of skepticism and intellectual curiosity. If universities are operate on the outer boundaries of our state of knowledge and to push those boundaries further outward, they must be places where new, unorthodox, controversial, and disturbing ideas can be raised and scrutinized. If students prepare themselves to critically engage with a wide range of ideas that they will encounter across their lifetimes in the world outside, they must learn to grapple with and critically examine those ideas they find difficult and offensive while they're still here on a college campus. For more than a century, university has been committed to the mission of advancing and disseminating knowledge and have recognized that the free-ranging exchange of ideas was essential to the realization of that mission. They have often pursued that mission imperfectly, and they have sometimes needed to be called to account to better appreciate and work to realize their own ideals. But recognizing and respecting the principle of free speech is difficult and challenging, but ultimately there's no alternative. We are dedicated to the pursuit of truth, and ultimately it's the pursuit of truth that universities are committed to, and that's a noble mission that's worth trying to preserve and maintain and extend. So thank you very much.
So thanks. So you mentioned that faculty, administrators, et cetera, have a responsibility to encourage students to exercise their responsibility in extending platforms well responsibly.
Right.
So I was wondering if you had any insight as to what precisely faculty and administrators should do in that regard. So one thing that you might worry about is that someone in a position of authority says, oh, are you sure you really want to do that? Then students fear that they'll be seen, in a negative light for suggesting that a certain speaker should come to campus. Mill obviously worried just as much about informal sanctions for things as formal ones. So how does a well-meaning faculty member approach that responsibility?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I mean, because I think we should be worried about informal pressures on campuses, and often it's those informal pressures that are the hardest ones to combat. It's one thing to design effective policies and regulations. It's another thing to actually foster a culture in which people are willing to explore difficult ideas. I think to some degree it's easier for students to, and others for that matter, to hear that kind of advice and hear those concerns if they think the person offering the advice and concerns are sympathetic more generally, right? So that they are not hearing it from somebody they regard as hostile to their core interests, and as a consequence, it becomes relatively easy to dismiss those concerns as not being serious and not being sufficiently engaging. So hopefully what you can get at least is students who can find people on campus that they can get advice from who they actually trust, who they think are on the same page with them more generally, are sympathetic to their general commitments and concerns and take their ideas seriously, and yet nonetheless are trying to facilitate and help them think through how do you best advance those ideas and how can you best have those conversations. So I think that helps in part, actually, just trying to create that kind of connection and try to connect up individual faculty and individual administrators with students in ways that students think this person is ultimately helpful to them and aligned with them and not somebody who's simply trying to shut down what it is they're trying to do. At the same time, students are still likely to have disagreements about what that ought to look like, and those disagreements are not unreasonable. Students have their own set of concerns, they're moved by their own set of concerns, and you can offer advice, but I think you shouldn't necessarily close them down. And students have to learn to make mistakes as well. And I think we ought to give students the freedom to be able to make mistakes and hopefully learn from them and move forward. Which is one reason why I'm very concerned, I think, by a lot of these policies that are sometimes being urged by politicians and others that want to take an extraordinarily punitive approach to thinking about college misconduct on college campuses, right? So disruptive protest and the like. And there are occasions when a punitive approach might be appropriate, but I think much more often what you want is a more educational approach where the goal is to try to help students think through what it is they're doing and how can you do this better. I think that's mostly effective rather than one that's concerned with trying to bring down a big club to hit people over the head with. And one consequence of that is, though, it means that students will make mistakes. That they will invite speakers they probably shouldn't have invited. They will disinvite speakers on occasion when they shouldn't have done that. They will disrupt things when they shouldn't have done that. And these things will happen, and the goal is how do we learn from those experiences? How can we talk about what we were doing and why we were doing it, and hopefully move forward from that. But I think it's challenging to do that in a very consistent way. And some of that work's got to be done by students themselves, right? I think actually there's also a limit to what faculty administrators can actually do and kind of nurture that kind of culture. Some of it's got to come from the students, ultimately. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that a public institution has some responsibility legally for protecting freedom of speech, whereas a private institution does not. Mm-hmm. But that also seems to open up the public institution to interference from political outsiders more openly, as well as public criticism in some ways. Do you think that public institutions thus are more likely to have larger sways in the pendulum between the two sides arguing over academic freedom or censorship? Or do you think that perhaps the insular nature of a private institution might make it easier for those kinds of things to happen without public criticism?
So I think it is true that public institutions are often more vulnerable to outside pressures of certain types, at least. They're vulnerable to politicians in ways that private institutions often aren't, or at least are less so. Politicians' first inclinations often intervene in public institutions, although frankly more of them are concerned with intervening in private institutions as well, for that matter. But one of the traditional challenges that state universities have had, and they continue to have them up to this present day, is that they are governed by boards of regents and boards of governors and trustees who are politically appointed. Those trustees sometimes take a very interventionist approach to trying to think about what's happening on college campuses. and often are trying to restrict what students and faculty are doing on college campuses in pretty aggressive ways. Sometimes those boards take a more hands-off approach. But it's one of the challenges for public universities is how do you navigate not only state legislatures and the like, but how do you navigate this politically appointed institution, this body that's directly overseeing what's happening on university campuses. And one of the openings then that students and others have on college campuses when they think that their rights are being abused on those campuses, though, is to go to court. And that does open the door to some avenues for resisting those pressures that are not so easily available on a lot of private campuses. I think private campuses see those pressures play out somewhat differently. So it may be less likely that a state legislator, for example, is going to try to intervene on a private campus, but much more likely that a donor or alumni group might try to intervene on a college campuses. And so for private universities, their pressures are often coming from people who actually have some institutional connection because they're donors, they're alums, they care about and are interested in the institution in various ways, but they also have leverage over that institution in various ways, and they often try to exercise it. And I think universities are struggling with that precisely because they don't want to cut those ties. They want those people to be part of the larger community that universities are trying to construct. But there's often a tension between what some of those people want and what's happening on the campus itself. And so I think the pressures come from different places at the private level and the public level. The avenues for pushing back are a little different as a consequence as well. Private universities, and they may be seeing more and more of this, can find themselves in court as well, in part because lots of private universities have fundamentally made contracts with students and faculty about these issues in ways that are similar to what constitutional law looks like in lots of contracts, and that opens them up to lawsuits when they aren't sufficiently respective of rights as well, and so we're starting to see a little bit of that also. So I think, like I said, the public and private universities are somewhat different in terms of where the pressures come from. I think it's also worth noting that private universities are also potentially different in terms of the mission, right? So I laid out this sort of basic mission that I think most American universities are committed to, which is this idea of advancing and disseminating knowledge. But some private universities do take a more restrictive view of what it is they're trying to accomplish. And I'm thinking particularly of some religious institutions that really think, for example, there are some ideas that are off the table because this is a community of faith that already has some pre-commitments and we shouldn't be exploring certain things. And I think that's not unreasonable. I think those are different kinds of institutions as a consequence. You have compromised what it is you're trying to accomplish as a university by accepting those kinds of restrictions. But on the other hand, if everybody knows what those restrictions are going in, if everybody's transparent about them, I think it's not unreasonable to say within the landscape of American higher education, it's useful to have private secular institutions that are trying to explore ideas quite freely, that have public universities trying to serve their particular function, but also some of these more restricted private institutions that are designed to serve a very particular mission that doesn't want to fully explore ideas. And one thing I worry about with sort of outside public political pressure is precisely to sort of flatten that out and say you can't have that diversity in that range. Everybody's got to look exactly the same. And I think we can do something in that too. Yeah.
So you said at various points that there are certain speakers that probably shouldn't be permitted on campus, and you said also that there should be some kind of screening process, and that only inquiry that is actually going to facilitate kind of good dialogue that allows people to engage should really be invited. So in your opinion, and obviously this varies campus by campus, but in your opinion, what makes a good speaker? What kind of opinions should be promoted and which ones should?
So let me modify this slightly. So my concern is to think that those of us inviting speakers have some responsibility to make reasonable choices about who we're inviting. Not necessarily to say the university shouldn't allow you to invite in speakers, because I think there's going to be a disagreement internally on campuses about what's a good speaker and what's not a good speaker and who ought to be invited and who's not. And ultimately, I think a campus is a healthier intellectual environment. There are spaces for even small groups of individuals who think they have particular ideas and speakers they're interested in to be able to explore those and not have the rest of the campus say, forget it, you're not allowed to do that, right? And so I think it's perfectly reasonable to push back on them and say, well, why are you exploring those ideas? Why with this speaker? What are you trying to accomplish with doing this? Is this the best way of doing it? But I think we should be very reluctant to try to close the doors on those and say that we ought to have some kind of administrative or larger democratic veto over what people are doing in terms of who they're choosing to bring to campus and the like. So So I think that in terms of sort of what basic rules look like, I actually would be, have very few restrictions on who's allowed to come to campus. I think, though, that doesn't change the fact there is nonetheless choices to be made by those of us who are inviting people to campus, and so we have to think carefully about what is it we're trying to accomplish and what we're doing here. Yeah, I think part of that challenge in thinking about what's a good speaker and what's not a speaker is trying to think about, are these ideas actually serious ideas? Again, people are going to differ about that. There's some people who are going to think that ideas are serious and important and worth pursuing. Other people are think ridiculous and not worth talking about. But you sort of want at least people to have, in good faith, to be thinking, look, these are ideas I want to hear and I want to explore because they are worth having a conversation about. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're important and worth having a conversation about because they have a lot of mainstream support in American society more generally. It may well be these are ideas that are well outside the mainstream. And universities ought to be open to those ideas, that we nonetheless take ideas seriously despite the fact that not very many people believe in them or because they seem pretty out there. And nonetheless, part of our concern ought to be, we'll bring those people in, let's hear the argument. And if they're not good arguments, we can reject that, but we should be open to hearing the arguments. But partially we have to think seriously to look at these ideas you actually want to hear about, and are these ideas that are going to be expressed in a way that's actually serious, or are we just having fun here? I think in addition, though, you want to be thinking about, is the person you're bringing in capable of actually representing those ideas in a serious way, that they can actually marshal arguments on behalf of those ideas, and are trying to do that, or instead are they there simply for the purposes of provocation or entertainment? There's room on campus to have people coming in for provocation and entertainment. They aren't contributing very much, intellectually speaking. And so I think student groups sometimes find themselves with a tendency to want to invite in people who are provocative in various ways, in part because college-age students like to be provocative, in part because you can get attention that way, and you can accomplish some very immediate things. But I think for purposes of the broader campus community, we don't mostly want provocation. We mostly want people who are capable of actually articulating interesting ideas in serious ways, even if we think they're very wrong ideas. So I'm much less concerned to that front, whether I think the ideas are actually mistaken, than I am sort of, is this person actually somebody that can advance them in an interesting way that's worth hearing from? And if so, then we ought to hear from them. I think also I should note, though, I think in that context as well, that universities are also somewhat complicated environments from speech perspective, and there are different responsibilities on different kinds of players within that context. So for example, universities have speaker series in which the campus administration brings in people, in which individual departments on campus bring in people, and campus programs bring in people. And I think they have some responsibility about who they're bringing in, that these be people who are actually fairly serious from a scholarly perspective and can actually meet some scholarly credentials, because if the political science department brings somebody in, they're vouching that this actually the person from a political science disciplinary perspective actually is bringing something to the table. That's different than what a student group's doing, though. The college Republicans, college Democrats are going to bring in a different kind of person than the political science department would bring in, and that's fine and reasonable, and we want them to be able to do that on college campuses, but we should expect that the standards are going to be different, the goals are going to be different, the kind of speaker they're going to bring in is pretty different. And I think Department of Political Science would come under quite proper criticism if they're bringing in the same kind of people that the college Democrats would want to bring in, or the college Republicans would want to bring in. We should expect them to be doing something different. But likewise, we should insist that the student groups should only bring in the same kind of people that the university president would bring in to give a talk. Students have different interests, different goals, different standards, and they should be able to do that as well. Yeah.
This is sort of picking up on the point you just made about differential responsibilities. This is actually a question that's come up in my own life a few times. It's a lot easier for students to enter the public square now than it ever has been because of the internet.
Right.
So a student newspaper is going to go on the internet. Students are going to comment on public Facebook pages, or they're going to tweet something.
Right.
And the question comes up pretty fast, or they start a move on petition, and it goes viral around the whole world, which happened on our campus a few years ago. At what point have the students, when they do that, open themselves up to whatever you want to throw at them? Like, if you think they've made a fool of themselves in their newspaper editorial or in their tweet or something, but you're a faculty member and your role is to be educating the students and to have, respect for the fact that they're still forming and that they shouldn't be, judged forever on the silliest thing that they said in college. Should freedom of speech go all the way to they're in the public square, so I'm gonna let loose with everything I have, or should you pull your punches at that moment and make the educational purpose paramount in order to spare the students public humiliation if they've gone out there with a stupid argument? This comes up more than you might.
No, it does come up more than you might think. It comes up, and so one thing I quickly encountered in trying to write this book, for example, is you want to talk about things that are happening on college campuses, and some of those things are in the kinds of free speech controversies that are happening on college campuses. And some of those controversies are spearheaded by students. And there's student publications saying things, there's student protesters saying things, there's student activists on campus saying things. And one challenge is, well, how much do you want to memorialize them in a book? Right? And as well as sort of make them go viral and talk about them in the public sphere more generally, how much newspaper attention should we pay these people, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess my own, and I think people can reasonably come to different approaches and conclusions about this stuff, but my own instinct on this is the ideas are fair game, and we all talk about the ideas, and I want to talk about the ideas. We all take students seriously in the sense that they're advancing ideas, and we ought to engage those ideas in a serious way. At the same time, I try to avoid name-checking students. I try to avoid actually calling students out by name, precisely because I don't want to sort of put them in the center of a controversy, or put them in the pages of a book that's going to be enduring, and such that 5 years later they're looking back on that saying, well, that was something I said when I was 18 and I no longer believe. I think we should be sort of forgiving on that, and sort of reluctant, I think, to drag students personally into these kinds of conflicts. And I think it's also true, though, this is a reminder that we also don't want to lean too heavily on ad hominems and passionate sort of claims. And so, the fact that sometimes the people we're tangling with, our students, for example, ought to be a reminder to us that we should treat them with respect and we should treat them seriously. And these are issues we care about, and we should engage them seriously. But we should treat the ideas seriously. We shouldn't be trying to call people names and call down the hounds of the internet on them. And there's a temptation to do that, and it's also easy to do that in these modern contexts. But and I like that. I probably am not perfect about how I've tried to do that in general. But my general guiding line on this is my goal is not to throw students under the bus. And so students are going to make mistakes. I said all kinds of stupid stuff when I was a student. I say stupid stuff now, but I did stupid stuff when I was a student. And and I don't want to hold students up for public derision for the ideas they have. I want to talk about the ideas. And I want to take those ideas seriously, but I try to avoid as much as I can holding the students up for public discussion in that regard. And I feel bad when students do find themselves drug into that situation, because it can be pretty ugly. And there's no reason why they need to be in the midst of that. Yeah.
Well, thank you, first of all. And I want to start by saying that I agree with everything you said so far. But I want
I'll get to something you want. Yeah.
Add a little bit of specificity and make a comparison between what is happening now. We're seeing a lot of unrest on college campuses, and the unwillingness of students to welcome certain ideas. With what happened during the neoliberal reform during the 1970s and 80s, where universities had this other revolutionary process going on. It was much quieter and it wasn't reported as much, because I think that the core of the situation here is the question of big megaphones versus small megaphones, and the impact that money plays into freedom of speech. So for example, I know for a fact that many people don't come to Freedom Project lectures because they are concerned with the funding of the operation. I am too. So the thing that I see missing from this discourse then is a perception of students with regards to this disparity. So when the neoliberal reform was happening and universities and think tanks were co-opted to push one idea of economics and freedom, there wasn't much power on the other side to make a counter-argument. Now, where students obviously see that the same process is going on, it's not like neoliberalism has gone away, they react in the only way they can I don't think it's always appropriate. I don't think that we always do it correctly. But by reacting, they also demonstrate that they don't have many other means to counterbalance the power of funding and having institutions not really being independent in terms of money and what ideas they generally purport to those who learn in these environments.
Yeah, so I think on university campuses in particular, I mean, I think it's true of American society more generally, but particularly on a university campus, we should be trying to nurture a pluralistic space in which there are lots of different ideas being expressed and relatively easy entry to be able to express those ideas. So it's not hard to start a student group in order to pursue ideas that you find interesting and worth exploring. That there are resources available to a wide range of student groups and others on campus in order for people to be able to bring to campus people who can explore those ideas or engage in activities to explore those ideas in a fairly serious way. We should be trying to resist having universities be monocultures in which there's sort of a single orthodoxy that's being developed in the university and other people have a hard time getting traction or having space to be able to express those ideas. I think it's nonetheless going to be true that for all kinds of reasons, partially because some ideas are more popular than others, partially because there's more resources behind them, whether the resources comes in terms of sort of pure money through the door, whether it comes in terms of institutional support of various ways. Some ideas are going to get more attention than other ideas on campus, and that's going to happen here as well as everywhere else, and that is true. I think that's not necessarily deeply problematic. What I'm much more concerned about is what's the range of other things, and are there opportunities for people to explore and hear the other side, hear the other arguments, explore those other arguments more broadly. And part of what I worry about when people are concerned about the size of platforms and who's funding what is precisely the motivation behind those is often to try to reduce the amount of speech, reduce the range of ideas that are being expressed on campus in order to shrink the sphere of public debate. Because there are some ideas that we think are too powerful someplace else, and so we shouldn't hear them here because we're concerned about who's supporting particular ideas. And I tend to want to think everybody should come in and have whatever conversations they want to have. And so I'm much less concerned, I think, about the particular sources of funding that come for particular kinds of activities on campus. What I'm much more concerned about is are you creating an environment on campus in which there's a wide range of opportunities for a wide range of people to pursue the particular ideas they find interesting and to explore them and publicly advocate for those ideas in ways that are meaningful and helpful for them. And if you've done that, then you've sort of done a lot of what universities ought to be trying to do, and you've served the students reasonably well at the end of the day. But yes, you want to follow up?
Yeah, follow-up. So, but isn't that creation of space and opportunity directly dependent on funding? And isn't the whole question of freedom of speech directly in this world where everything works with money? How is that not the primary concern in the whole freedom of speech discourse?
Well, it's not the primary. I mean, so everything works with money in the sense that everything has resource constraints, and you need resources in order to do things and have conversations. And it actually doesn't require that much in the way of resources to have a lot of conversations on college campuses, but it requires some. And some universities operate in a much more constrained resource environment than others from that perspective, right? And so I benefit from being at a place like Princeton that has a lot of resources. As a consequence, they could pump a lot of money into a lot of stuff. Any student who has an idea of things they want to do on a campus like that can find some resources to be able to pull together that and sort of pursue those ideas. Not everybody is so well situated, and that makes it much more challenging on those university campuses where there in fact is a pretty limited pie to be divided up. And then there's a genuine challenge. Okay, how do you divide that up in a way that is sufficiently nurturing of the kind of robust intellectual community that you want to try to create on that college campus? And I think those choices are to some degree going to be very particular about those particular environments and how to best make those choices. I think that the guiding principle in general in trying to make those choices is our goal ought to be to facilitate a wide range of views being expressed on campus and be able to facilitate people being able to pursue ideas they find interesting on the college campus, and hopefully minimize the amount of waste on college campuses. So I think, for example, when we're making choices about what kind of speakers do we want to bring to campus, well, I think as a question of prohibition, we should prohibit very few people from coming to campus. In terms of who we were going to fund to bring to campus, when we have a limited set of funds to use, we have to make some good choices about not spending our money on bringing in people that are not going to advance ideas in a serious way, and are not going to put in front of people ideas that are worth talking about, and to try to put our money into things that in fact are going to be more valuable, or they're going to actually enhance the student's experience on campus and allow them to actually learn some things, engage in some ideas in a serious way, including ideas they might reject at the end of the day, but nonetheless ideas that are worth hearing and worth talking about. And the less money you have to work with, the more important those decisions become, because you don't want to waste any of those dollars if you don't have very many to spend. Yeah.
I am so surprised that someone so young could come up with an idea and a question based on money. If someone created a cure for cancer and that person, and it generated a lot of money and support, but that person's core belief is not the same as yours, are you going to deny yourself treatment because of that money came from some political ideology that you didn't agree with? He's talking about the big picture of exchange, and you're talking about filtering the type of exchange based on the backing, which you would disagree with. That's something that only old people think about. So are you guided, your lifestyle is guided by who's behind the thing you wear and who's behind the thing you eat to determine the value and quality of your life? He's talking about exchanges, and where everything should be allowed to exchange. You're talking about disqualifying based on the money that's behind it. In the real world, the opposition of conservative thinking is backed by a very rich man who happens to be very liberal. There's equal sides of money going back and forth, supporting either movement. So you can't judge by money and backing. You have to go by the content to have that exchange that exposes everybody to all ideas. You can't filter it because the backing happens to be, for example, this Freedom Project. You're saying that they're afraid that it's backed by some other kind of money, and if you attend, you would be supporting the backer of the idea of the Freedom Project. That is so narrow-minded, so picky for someone so young.
May I respond?
It's freedom of speech, come on.
So first of all, I never said I was disqualifying any kind of exchange. In fact, I am here and asking these questions. I am saying that the exchange itself and how the exchange happens and what kind of exchange happens is deeply influenced by the way that money circulates. For example, in the early 1930s, scientific research led to experimenting on African American men who were given syphilis without treatment, despite the presence of penicillin, in order to advance, syphilis treatment for other people. Now, those studies, of course, were founded by a constituency that was still extremely racist at the time. Another example that happened recently is in 2003, because of certain big money pools that have the ability to control the media in a certain way, talking about Rupert Murdoch, despite there not being any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, what we saw was an echo chamber of accounts that said that weapons of mass destruction were undeniable. And so we went to war with a country that, at the end, had none. So I'm saying that, no, I'm not necessarily filtering out things based on money, but I am saying that the central question is how do we make it so that money does not become a weight that imbalances and ruins the way that the exchange happens and the
You
way
won't
that
know anything is ruined until it's happened.
exactly,
A lot,
which
okay,
is
a
why,
lot
which is
of
why I'm
things.
using data points on a
And
graph
right,
and
but you're
tracing the
picking
line of
out
best fit.
examples of bad things that happen. But there's a lot of good examples of good things that happen because of good
I
big
don't
money.
deny it.
Right, and so they counterbalance. So in this world, there's life and there's death. There's pain and suffering from ill good, and then there's joy that is created from big money. So it all balances back and forth. You can't pick and choose based on those examples and then make a conclusion
Right,
of ill
except that what
good.
is happening today is that we're seeing an incredible skew of the capital accumulation towards one side of the graph. If like this is distribution of capital and this is how much capital and how many people get to have that capital, the line that may have a curve at the end is approaching a right angle, which means that by the way that information works, capital and that joy that you're talking about is being distributed further and further for a smaller amount of people. So I don't think that that reasoning makes much sense looking at the empirical data.
This country was founded on capitalism
Yes,
and making money, and there will be people who make money and there will be people who don't make as much money. But you cannot discredit those who worked hard and invented things and created money and wealth for other people to have jobs and go on and go on. And, you know, you cannot be anti-money.
So I think we did have some other hands together. I want to make sure we bring in some other people in the conversation.
I'm sorry.
Hi. So you talked in the beginning about when you ask people, "Are you in favor of free speech?"
Sure.
They'll say yes, and
Yeah.
then when you kind of start asking them about situations, they'll start carving out caveats. So
Right.
how can we as students try, and just as people going into the job field and things like that, just help change people's opinions, start getting them to engage with ideas, and kind of stop this cancel culture of "I've decided this is wrong,
Right.
therefore it's off the table to engage with"?
Yeah, I think it's challenging, and some people are not very open, right, to hearing ideas that they disagree with. They're sort of dug in. They think they know what the arguments are. Everybody's got a limited amount of resources in terms of their own time to spend as well, and their own energy. And so it's reasonable to make some choices about what you're going to spend your time talking about and listening to, and what you're not. And so there are some real limits as to what you can do. At the same time, though, and it's part of my own concern and my own work in this project as well as other things I work on, you know, my goal is precisely to be able to try to not just talk to people who already agree with me. I'm trying to talk to people who don't agree with me and people who are in the middle and not certain what they ought to think. And that means taking very seriously the opposition. I mean, taking very seriously it means taking seriously what the alternative arguments are and what the counter arguments are, and actually not trying to brush past them or mischaracterize them, but try to take them seriously on their own terms, try to build them up to be as strong as you can in order to understand them as well as you can, and then engage them in a serious way. It sometimes means modifying your own positions, and it's part of that engagement. But people respond, I think, if you're willing to engage seriously with their ideas. People are more open than having those conversations and being open then to your ideas as a consequence of that. So you know, I'm often trying to advance in the kind of work I do. I'm often trying to advance ideas that are controversial in various ways, that run against views of important people within my field as well as in society more generally. And you know, engaging seriously with those disagreements is a helpful starting point. I think it's also helpful to think about where people are coming from in these ideas, right? And so you want to be able to try to take seriously not only what ideas people have, but also what their concerns are, what's motivating them, what are they worried about, and try to think through how you can appeal to those concerns and get yourself on the same page, so at least we're having a common conversation, right? And we're still going to have disagreements. We still may walk away deeply divided about things. But we can't get to the conversation and can't listen to each other very seriously if we aren't taking seriously what our concerns and motivations and worries are. And so in this context of thinking about campus free speech issues, for example, you know, I partially then trying to think this through and trying to think through then what are the things that the people who want to be more restrictionist about free speech than I do, people who are more concerned about restricting speakers on campus than I think we ought to be doing, people who want to fire faculty because they're saying controversial things in ways I think are inappropriate. I want to try to think through in part what their arguments are about why they think that's a good idea. And partially I want to think about, well, what's bothering them, what's their concerns, what's motivating them to want to have those kinds of arguments, and are there ways I can chip away at that and develop some common ground so that we can come together on some things. Look, you're not going to persuade everybody. There's going to be some people who are going to disagree with you nonetheless. There are going to be some people who don't want to hear you out, and that's fine. But I think a lot of people are more open to it. If you can offer arguments in a way that is sensitive and sympathetic to their concerns and are open to serious engagement. And so I have very little patience for those whose goal as in the realm of ideas is to try to stick a thumb in somebody's eye. Right? I don't think you're accomplishing very much, and I think you're just pushing people away. It's not how I want to try and approach things. I want to try to get people at least talking. And then I want to hear what it is they disagree with. And sometimes they'll persuade me that I was wrong, actually, and so I ought to change my own position. But sometimes I can actually persuade them. And at the very least I can persuade other people that are listening, right? Even though I can't necessarily persuade those who are already dug in and have very committed views. There's lots of other people who don't know what they ought to be thinking, who want to hear more. And I think this is a topic, for example, where people are genuinely interested in hearing more, right? There are people who have some inclinations as to what they think the right answers are. But I actually think that this is a space where people think it's important and they want to learn more about what are the complications here, what are the complexities, what are the difficulties, how should we work them through. And so I want to help them try to think that through. And to whatever point they wind up reaching at the end of the day. But I want them to be doing it in a serious and sophisticated way rather than a stupid way. And if I can do that, then I'm happy.
I think
yes.
we have time maybe for one or two more questions.
Sure.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for coming. I have sort of a follow-up question to this. So you're sort of talking about this tolerance and seeing things from an opposing point of view's perspective. And something that I hear a lot on our campus is that we don't want X kind of speech because it causes harm to us.
Right.
And we don't want to carve out space for this because that's harmful to us. Like, I guess, what is the most appropriate response? And that seems like very much like a dead end to me. Like, it's harmful.
Right.
Case closed.
Yeah,
Like, it
yeah.
seems like an end of conversation. I guess, what's a response to that?
I think it's very hard, actually, because I think it's designed to be a conversation stopper, and it is, right? Because it's hard to actually overcome that if people want to stop at that point, right? I think in part what you, and I think people who are really dug into that view, probably you can't make much headway with, fundamentally, because they in fact are trying to stop the conversation, and they don't really want to hear you out on that. And then, so my larger concern on that front is there are lots of other people who hear that kind of argument are not actually committed to it necessarily, and so they're more open to making space. And then the concern's got to be to say, in part, look, what's the harm you're worried about here exactly? And how can we approach this in a way that we can talk about serious ideas in a serious way without creating harm you ought to actually care about? And so I don't want to be dismissive of people who think that there are harms associated with speech. There are genuine harms associated with speech. Some speech is dangerous, right? And that some ideas are dangerous, and that's true. The problem is we don't know which ones they are. And some of the ones we hold already are dangerous and harmful. And so all we can do then is treat ideas seriously, recognizing they are in fact harmful and dangerous sometimes, but nonetheless there are things we have to explore and things we have to think through carefully. And then at the end of the day we come to conclusions we need to reject some of them, we ought to reject some of them. That also means though, and I think part of this sort of language about harm that surrounds some of these conversations, is also very personalistic, and I think partially we ought to be as much as we can trying to, which is why it's when trying to think about students and their speech, for example, and how to engage it. And as much as possible, we ought to be trying to engage the ideas and not the people. And so, people care about their ideas. Their ideas have consequences for them personally, and that's just going to be true. But that nonetheless doesn't mean that you have to dive into the personal stuff. As much as you can, you want to try to extract and abstract away from some of the personal stuff and try to think a little more about, okay, well, let's think about these ideas from a somewhat abstracted way. And let's recognize that these ideas are things some people take seriously, and as a consequence, we need to understand them well. And so can we hold them to some degree at arm's length and explore them and see what the attractions are to them or the problems associated with them before we simply reject them. And so can we have the conversation in a way that is perceived as less harmful and less problematic, right? And that's what we're trying to do in classrooms, for example, right? I mean, so as a teacher, I'm certainly dealing with subject matters that people are disturbed by in various kinds of ways, right? And so the question, how do you introduce students to that material and have them think about it carefully and seriously, despite the fact that they can find it very disturbing? And I want to bring that same kind of effort into the public sphere more generally. I think we ought to be trying to do as much of that as we can in the public sphere as what I hopefully I'm trying to do in the classroom as well. But the answer cannot just be, okay, we're going to set these ideas aside, we're not going to talk about them because they're just too difficult. That's horrible in the classroom context and in research. I think it's also very problematic in the public sphere as we're trying to talk about political and social ideas as well. And so we got to find ways to get past that. We got time for another one?
Yeah, this should be the last one.
This should be the last one. So yeah, sure.
Hi, thank you.
It better be a good one.
Thank you for So I'm curious if you see there being any limits on ideas. You're talking about sort of generally in the abstract,
Right.
uncomfortable and dangerous ideas.
Right.
And in asking that, I'm also sort of reminded of the marketplace of ideas trope, which has holds such sway these days. I believe it came from a from a dissent of Justice Holds.
Mm-hmm.
It's a heuristic. It's not an
Right.
empirically proven
Right.
model.
Right.
And so the idea there is that good ideas
Right.
rise and bad ideas
Yeah.
fall. So I'm sort of bemused by the fact that bad ideas seem to, we're still talking about Nazism, we're still talking about white supremacy.
Right.
I was again bemused by Erwin Chemerinsky's book on campus speech,
Right.
where he used Charles Murray as an example. And he said he gave him as an example of when the marketplace of ideas was working because his ideas had been discredited. And I'm sort of reading it thinking, and yet,
Yeah.
he is on a tour
Right.
of campuses. So I guess I'm sort of, again, how, it's sort of like, it's always Groundhog Day. Like how many times do we debate Nazism? How many times do we debate white supremacy? I mean, World War II sort of, one would have thought, determined it.
Yeah, no, I think, so I think we can't be too optimistic about this, that bad ideas can take root and survive, and people are often attracted to bad ideas. And they can be very persistent.
So do we give them a forum?
Well, so like I said, then I think we have to think carefully about, so the one very optimistic approach is to think, well, we can expose those bad ideas as being bad, and people will then be persuaded, and they will go away.
Not
Right?
happening.
Right, not entirely happening. Part of the concern, though, is things will go away for a time being, but then they will return, right? And so you gotta be ever vigilant to continue to expose the reasons why these are bad ideas. And so you can't just assume that, well, I can expose them once and then we're done. These ideas will never recur. The ideas will come back, and they'll come back sometimes in a new form. And so we gotta be constantly willing to engage them and fight them back, because they will recur, and we can't just assume that, well, we did that 40 years ago, so why are we talking about it again? So I think we have to be vigilant about that. We have to recognize the ideas will be persistent and they will return. There are reasons why they want to return, and so we got to push back. I think we do want to be very cautious in a university environment. In particular, we want to be a little cautious about trying to think about, and it's difficult, I think, in a university environment for this reason, in this sense. So partially what we want to do in a university is we want to be thinking about ideas that are outside the mainstream. We want to be open to ideas that are dissenting and unconventional and weird.
Discredited. I mean, I guess.
And sometimes discredited, right? Because we want to be open to
Bad ideas.
We want to be open to bad ideas on university campuses, and we want to be able to hear on bad ideas in university campuses. So on the one hand, we want to be able to bring those in. On the other hand, of course, we want to be able to evaluate them and recognize them as bad ideas and shove them out again. And so That means, I think, in part, we've got real differences in responsibility, between like departments of faculty and student groups, for example. So I think it would be deeply disturbing if a university geology department wanted to sponsor talks on flat earth theory, or a biology department wanted to sponsor anti-vaxxers to come give talks, precisely because they're supposed to be trying to filter out ideas that they think are in fact bad and rejected. On the other hand, I think on the university campus, we also shouldn't be, I think we should be reluctant to sort of prohibit students if they want to hear those ideas from hearing them. And we should be trying to foster in students the ability then to be able to identify why it is they're bad ideas, and to expose them to the arguments against those ideas as well as the arguments for them. But it's a difficult thing as to how do we open our doors so we can hear the non-mainstream ideas that we think we ought to take seriously, while also excluding the ideas that are just kooky and not worth taking seriously. And we're going to make some mistakes there, right? Because we're open in that sense, we're going to hear from some people that really probably shouldn't have heard from, because they were a waste of time. And sometimes we'll see that in hindsight, and that was a waste of time, we shouldn't have done that. And sometimes we won't be so quick to recognize it, but I think the fact is we're going to be always perpetually open to having some of those things. But we should also be cautious about not trying to artificially elevate ideas that are in fact not important and not serious. We shouldn't be artificially trying to go out and say, okay, well, can we get the Bigfoot specialist to come in and talk because we haven't heard enough about why Bigfoot's real, and why the Earth is flat and why reptiles actually rule the Earth, right? So we shouldn't go looking to give platforms to people that have actually, that what I think are actually sincerely think are bad ideas. And we think there's good reasons to reject them. On the other hand, we also shouldn't stick our head in the sand when those bad ideas become prominent in the public sphere, for example. We should be willing to engage them and talk about them precisely because they have real influence out in the world. And once they have that status, then we got to start taking them very seriously inside of the university as well, and start engaging them in ways that we might have said 5 years before, this is a dumb idea, not worth taking seriously. Once it has real consequences out in the world, then you guys say, okay, well, I got to deal with it anyway, even if it is a dumb idea. So I think it's a balancing act, and that part of what we will be doing on universities is spending time talking about some pretty bad ideas. but that's sort of what we do. And a lot of things I think are pretty bad ideas. Weirdly enough, my colleagues think are actually good ideas, and so and that's part of the problem, right? So so if I got to choose which are the good ideas and which are the bad ideas, it'd be all much simpler. But the problem is the world's not like that, right? There are other people living in it. They have their own ideas. I tried for years to convince my daughter, right? She ought to accept all my ideas as being the true ideas, and oddly enough, she had her own ideas. And you got to learn how to deal with that fact that people have their own ideas, and how do you navigate the fact then that people you love and care about nonetheless are kooky and have weird ideas.
Seems like a good place to stop.